We're in this session on unpacking, and what you see here is an outline of our BetterMan journey. So just to kind of give you a map. You know, I hate trying to go places without knowing where I'm going. One time I was up in the East Tennessee, headed up to this like lodge cabin kind of thing, and when I got about halfway up the mountain on an icy road, the GPS stopped working. And I could not find, like I had to drive back down the hill, map it out like the old days, like I needed a MapQuest app to print out, my directions, but how to find the place. I like to know where I'm going. I like to know how to get there. So you'll see session 1 was about understanding the present. That was, the stats, like 40% of boys are growing up without a dad in the home. Used to be 5% in the 60s. You watch family shows. Now, the dad is always the idiot, the butt of the joke, can't do anything right. And so that was session 1. Session 2 through 4, so we're right in the middle of that. We're addressing the past, kind of dealing with some of those past issues in our life. It's important we do that before we move to the future, and that's where we'll get into 5 through 10. We'll envision the future. We'll get that definition of manhood, and there's going to be practical how-tos for living it out in the 21st century. And this stuff is insanely practical. Once you get past, you got to unpack everything, okay? It's been around for 30 years. They seem to have a pretty good plan in place when they do on that. And so when we look at this stuff, I'll be honest, last week I told my story, and I didn't want to. You kind of feel vulnerable. You're out there, kind of sharing wounds in your own life or things that you went with or your dad did that you feel shame about. But we get to that point, man, I don't like this feeling. And we tend to want to pull away at that point. We're at the sticking point where some men are going to find excuses not to come back. And that's why it's important. Like, we don't want to be those men. We want to push through that and be better for it. And I can promise you we'll be better for it as we get into this. And so as we stick with it, now's the time we jump into our 2 action steps for addressing the past, which is at the bottom of page 23. We're going to look at these 2 action steps for a little bit, then we're going to talk about trouble spots and then action steps on that, okay? So on the bottom of 23, we pick up with that looking back and examining our past. That's number 1 right there. One of the reasons I do like telling my story is because people will come up to me and say, I've gone through something similar in my life. I've dealt with some of those same things. When I hear your stories, I hear some of the same things. I can relate to that kind of idea. But when we talk about examining our past, some of you experienced great trauma. Maybe some of you grew up where dad wasn't there. Or you grew up where mom wasn't there. Or you grew up where there was a glory child in your family, where one of the kids got all the affection and the praise, and you've been your whole life trying to prove it should have been you. Sometimes you were the glory child, and you spent your whole life trying to prove you deserved the affection and love that you got from that. Some of us lost family members at an early age, whether through divorce, death, maybe a loss of a sibling. And when we look back at those, these are all parts of our past that we need to be sure we're aware of. As you see in this, it helps us connect the dots. You see that in verse 23. When my kids go to the restaurant, sometimes they'll have the little connect the dot thing on their menu. And I don't know why there's a menu. Give them chicken tenders and mac and cheese or, cheese pizza. They don't need 4 options. My kids only need 2. I don't know what yours. But they'll play the little connect the dots. You connect all the dots, and all of a sudden you have a picture in that. When we look at our past, it helps us connect the dots so we can see a better picture of us. And we have a better picture of us, we can know how we're getting to the next place to take our next steps through that. A clearer picture, how it impacts us as well. So that's on page 23. Then you jump into the next part of unpacking, and that's engaging our trouble spots. Because if we don't, without realizing it, it can be like taking baggage through life we don't even know that's there. Now, I don't know if you've gone to the airport, but I hate it. I'm not one of those guys that flies all the time. So I get there and I forget, and I've got loose change, I've got a belt, I've got shoes with shoelaces, all this stuff. But do you see those guys that come through, and they've got like their super suitcase, and they like pop it out, and their shoes fly off, and their belts fly, they're done in like a minute. And I'm, 10 minutes later, I'm still trying to put everything back in my pockets and wondering what happened to my favorite pocket knife that I left back at TSA because I forget those kind of things. But, baggage slows us down. when you're trying to get through that place, but also in life, the emotional baggage can slow us down. But we get so used to carrying it, we don't even know. You just get stronger over time. You just start carrying it around. You don't realize, to some, you might look like you're carrying 10 bags on your back, and we just think, I got this. I can handle it. I'm used to it. But I think back to some of my friends that, you're talking about unpacking our baggage. I had one friend, he lost about 100 pounds. And he talked about the difference in his life. Like, he could tie his shoes without being winded. I've gotten to that stage where I gained just enough weight. I don't like tying my shoes because my belly gets in the way kind of things. But he talked about couldn't tie his shoes well. All he wore were slip-ons. He was ready for the airport, but that's just because he couldn't tie his shoes. But then he talked about he could go upstairs. He could do things. He didn't realize what he had lost until he lost all that weight, and he felt that freedom. That's what we want to have help with us when we talk about dealing with some of this stuff, engaging those trouble spots. Now, when we talk about a trouble spot, that's any unresolved issue from the past where the lack of closure adversely impacts and shapes the direction and dynamics of a man's life now. So anything that's unresolved. I think one of the ways we look at that is the idea of wounds, and we're going to talk about that. But right before second grade, I was with my grandfather, and he took me out to one of our family's houses, and they had a mean dog, but I didn't know it. And so I'm just standing there. A dog walked up to me, and he jumped up and licked my face. And then I looked down, and my shoes turned red because he hadn't licked my face. In that split second, he had cut me on my upper lip, my bottom lip, and right under my eye, about a half inch from my eye. So I nearly lost my eye. This whole side, I remember touching it, and it felt like a freshly cut watermelon. The meat part of that's what my lip felt like. And they were able to kind of sew it all back together. They said, he'll never be the same. We didn't know what I was going to look like, and I got lucky. I mean, this is who I am. This is what I look like. You say, it really messed me up. But I mean, for the most part, I don't have the jagged stuff, but kids still see the scar. And, they'll come up to me, what happened to your face? Kids have no filter. They're just going to ask you that. And so I'll tell them I got bit by a dog. I got bit here, up here, and then behind my ear. And when they come and look at my ear, I bark at them. And then they run away in fear. And that's to teach them a life lesson, not to ask somebody what happened to your face. But, I had those scars, but now I don't want a dog in my face. I love animals. I do not want a big dog in my face because I know exactly what they can do in a split second. I don't care whose dog it is. I don't really care. I don't want them in my face. Like, there's a visceral reaction for me. I don't want dogs in my kids' face. And my kids don't want dogs in their face because they've seen and been barked at enough times that they know that's not something we play around with. But that's a physical wound. You can see it, the scars from it. But sometimes we have scars in our soul. And we think, I'm fine. It's okay. It's just a flesh wound. And your friends are looking at it going, you're bleeding out at the same time. We sometimes try to minimize some of that, and we're going to see that in there. That's those trouble spots. So we need to courageously step into those trouble spots, as it says there in the middle of page 24, to seek to resolve it. And sometimes that takes counsel, support of others, and we're going to talk about that in this as well. But we want to jump into the idea, and the key word there is courage. It takes courage to do this. As men, we don't like this. We want to do it on our own. We want to, and there's nothing wrong with courage, but sometimes it's the courage to get help. Like you break your arm in 3 spots, you're like, I don't need a doctor. I can fix this myself. Sometimes it's better to get the help from someone else through that, or at least help somebody else help you set the bone, if nothing else. Now, to do this, there's common trouble spots that undercut our manhood. And this is 6 trouble spots or wounds that over the last 30 years they've seen come time and again in men's fraternity. These are the ones that seem to hang men up, hold them back from what they are called to be. And so we're going to just kind of walk through these first off. And the first one we run into in the trouble spot is the dad wound. The dad wound. You see it in your notes. It's impossible, as you see in your notes, it's impossible to overstate the impact of dad on a son's life. Even when whatever your dad was like in life, it says, know this, when you grew up and left home, you didn't realize it. You didn't leave your dad behind. He went with you as feelings and impressions that you now carry within yourself. And so as we look at that, this is probably the most significant one impacting men today, is the absent father wound. And that's why it calls it the absent dad at the end of that. The dad wound can look a lot of different ways, but the absent dad tends to be a lot of hurt. Maybe for you, your dad, you lost him through divorce. Maybe that he abandoned your family. Maybe he was just physically absent. For some of you, dad came home every day, but he was emotionally absent. We talked about that before in this. I've had friends with great dads, and I'll see their relationship, and I'll see what they do together, and you'll see these moments, and I just admire their relationship. And then I think to myself, man, I wish I had that. That's that wound in me. Like, I feel it sometimes, and maybe you felt that. You saw other people in their relationships, and you go, wish I had that in my life. That's where that kind of comes to the surface sometimes through that. And so in the movies, you start looking at movies, there's a lot about unresolved issues with dad, but especially in music. And you start looking at different songs, as you're going to see here in just a second. I think about Papa Was a Rolling Stone. That's a really sharp lyric. When you start thinking about it, because a rolling stone gathers no moss, because it's always on the move. But you start to listen to the lyrics. Listen to some of these about Papa was a rolling stone. No place was home. He wasn't there. He's gone. Maybe that's the lyrics to your story. I grew up hearing the song, where it goes, cats in the cradle and the silver spoon. When you coming home, Dad? I don't know when, but we'll get together then. Maybe for some of you, that's more of what you think of. Your dad was so driven, so he was never home for you. He said he'll make it up later. You see on page 25, I don't know why they picked Everclear for their lyric instead of Papa was a rolling stone, but look at what it says. Daddy gave me a name, then he walked away. I will never be safe. I will never be sane. I will always be weird inside. I will always be lame. Daddy gave me a name, then he walked away. Daddy gave me a name, then he walked away. Maybe some of you could have written those lyrics. Dad gave you a name, but little else. He gave you a last name or just your first name. And that was all that he gave you. And so you feel that. It compounds itself in so many ways, as we're going to see in this. The absent dad can also lead to another thing that brings on trouble, and that is the too much mom. Too much mom. In the absence of dad, because mom is loving by nature, she overcompensates. She often moves into that place and provides emotional support that she needs. You're providing it to her. She's providing it to you. And there's an healthy relationship that can come out of that, and nobody's intentionally trying to do it. There's nothing, you do it out of faithfulness. You love your mom, you're trying to take care of her, but sometimes that bond can go to a point of a wound in your life, okay? My mom, when my dad was gone, she could have easily been that one that nurtured me to death. Instead, she was too busy working, I think. That probably allowed that to not happen. I don't have the too much mom. I've just got the absent dad, I know where my wounds are, okay? And so when I go through this, I've seen some other wounds come up out of the way this is done, but sometimes that too much mom wound comes in, and when you see it, it plays out in two different ways. And you see that here. It can lead to sons either becoming overly dependent on women or overly dominant. The overly dependent on women, you see that guy, he's so used to mama taking care of him, soothing all his issues, that when he gets married, he's frustrated when his wife doesn't do the same for him. And when that happens, usually he runs back to mom and gets that emotional support from mom. And now there's this tension between mom and wife. And he's trying to take care of both. And he's on that balance. I don't know if you've got friends like that or if you've experienced that, but I've got friends like that. They don't know how to make the healthy break so that they can have the relationship they need with their wife, for instance. The other side is that overly dominant. This tends to be the idea of when you get into it. Let me see where the statistic was. You think about sports. There's certain athletes, the way they treat women. A lot of times when there's a lack of a father in the home, the absent dad wound, and too much mom, they become dominant toward women. They treat women a certain way. Like no woman's ever going to tell me or talk to me like that. There's this idea of just almost threatened by strong women. And I'm not talking about women that are Karens and that are overbearing and all that stuff. I'm just talking about they just don't want a woman to tell them anything. I had a friend, he had that wound as strongly as I've ever seen a man. It played out not just with his wife, but with everybody. Nobody could tell him what to do. I mean, I can still see him to this day with his arms folded like a little child. Talking about no one's going to tell me what to do. And this guy, military, Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, guy on one side and just so passive and so overly attached to mom. Like he told me in a group with his wife in the room, if she asked me to buy her flowers for her birthday, I wouldn't do it. And he was proud of that. He's like, because I'm never going to do anything anybody tells me what to do. And he would never buy her flowers if she asked for them on her birthday. There's a wound there. You got to understand something's wrong with that, because his wife was not that way, that kind of thing. She was not overbearing at all. And so you just start to see this. What happens is when you're in men's fraternity, and I call it that because the BetterMan series as we're in now, you get a common language and you start to see the wounds of others. It's not just about your wounds. You start to see why your friends act a certain way, how they act a certain way. And that's what we're going to see play out in this as well. It helps you understand your friends, if nothing else, through that. And so we want to get a clear picture. So how do I become the man that I need to be? And that's where that third one comes in, the lack of a clear manhood vision. Some of this is overlap from the other weeks, but, do you have a vision for your own personal life? You ask most men, what's your vision for your life? Monday. You ask them tomorrow, what's their vision? Tuesday. Get to the weekend. That's about as far as they look ahead, but we won't have a clear picture as we move ahead, and we're going to see that when we get into that definition and start looking through that, but just a lack of clarity. Because when you don't have that vision, how can you move towards something if you don't have the goal? And so I think a lot about that when I think about some of the men in Spring Hill where I was at in the suburbs for 18 years, because one of my goals when I moved to an area is to understand the culture I'm living in. I treated myself as a missionary. What are their hopes, dreams, fears? What's the values? And there's even a book I've got called Death by Suburb. There's a whole different set of core values in the suburbs than where we live today. But the drivenness in this community was one, and it talks about how vision is handed down to the kids. These guys would move to the area. Spring Hill grew from 7,000 people in 1990 to 50,000 people today in a 5-mile radius. In 5 miles, we had 3 or 4 high schools before I left. I can't even tell you how many elementary schools. I mean, just gobs of kids. But people would move there because they'd get these jobs in Nashville, and they would commute to their work, and they wanted their families in the suburbs, and the suburbs are built around accessibility to everything. There's a park nearby, there's a school nearby, there's restaurants nearby. You never have to leave your little bubble. But just the drivenness. These families, I started noticing we had a lot of twins in Spring Hill. Like a lot of twins. Now, my nephew's expecting twins right now. Twins are natural, especially with 50,000 people. But you started catching how many were twins because of fertility treatments. And I'm not talking about the lady in her mid-30s taking the fertility treatments. These are people in their 20s having twins because I've got to have the job, or I got to get the wife. I've got to have the job. I've got to have the house. I've got to have the kids. I've got to get the toys. Like they have a plan for life. And that's what they're focused on, is to get all those things. And time's ticking. You're 25. Well, we don't have kids yet. We need to have those 2.5 kids, so that we can feel, what we're needing to do. And so I just watched that over and over. I remember watching sports. I watched a high school football game in a rural area, and the commentators made like 5 comments for the whole game. And then I went to a 6-year-old boys football game in Tennessee, and the commentator talked the entire time like he was on ESPN. The boys were throwing passes, okay, and catching them. I mean, at 6, okay? Usually it's like jet sweep, fastest kid, go. That's about all you get at 6 years old. And they were throwing passes. They had real plays. Then halftime hit. And they were playing another, like, small town football team, and their girls came out and cheered for a minute. And then the 6-year-old girls came out for the local team. Dun, 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 dun. I mean, like music playing. They did a pyramid. They were doing somersaults. Like, it was crazy. And those dads were watching those boys play. They were living through their boys because they wanted them to do what they couldn't get to. They were driven, and they were carrying it on, and they were passing it on to their kids. And you just see the amount of just anxiety pills at middle school was so high because kids were under so much pressure from dads a lot of times, or just both parents. So there's nothing wrong with drive, okay? I admire men with drive. You start a business, you take risks, you do things. I think about Saving Private Ryan, the movie. When their guys are on the beach storming Normandy, and they're in that boat. and that wall drops down and the bullets are flying and they rush to the beach. I admire that, like the amount of courage doing that. What I'm trying to get to is I want to make sure if we're going to give our lives to something that we're storming the right beach, that we're focused on the right things, what really matters in life, because the guy who dies with the most toys still dies. And like, what kind of impact is that on the kids? Because all of a sudden one day, cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon. When you coming home, son? I don't know when, but we'll get together then. It's like we're going to try to play catch up through that. And so out of this, you got to have that vision. And when we talk about vision, it's taught. And so that's why it's passed on, but it's a learned lifestyle, it says here. You see it modeled in men. You see it carried forth. And so this isn't just for those of us with boys. This is for all of us. Those young men around us need people to teach them those skills. And again, 40% don't have a dad anyway. And so for us to be those role models, if you're not a dad of a boy or anything like that. But this idea of being taught. When did you realize you were a man? Like, when did you say, I'm a man now? Or when did someone say, you're a man now? Was it when you turned 18? Was it when you drank your first beer? Was it when you had sex for the first time? It says, make a man out of you, like those kind of phrases. Like, what was it that you knew you were a man? These are like milestones, but boys can do all those milestones. None of that makes us a man. Without intentional vision of what really makes a man, there's a lot of boys living in grown men's bodies to this day, and they think, I'm a man because I've done these things. Yeah. And so I've seen teenagers, I'm a man, I'm 14, I can do what I want. I've had them say that in my house so many times, over 7 years of fostering teenagers, 15, whatever age they're at, they're ready, because they think they've got all that they need. They can't pump gas in a car. They can't keep a job. They can't even study at school long enough to pass the class, but they're ready for life. That's how they feel about it. And so we just need to have that clear vision, and we got to be able to cast that to others. That's where this idea of manhood being taught. But a lack of it is one of those problems. Now the next one, and it can be simple skills that we assume we know, but again, we think we should know these things, but it's taught. So the third one is unprocessed trauma. And that can be through, the death of somebody, death of a sibling. Maybe you experienced sickness. Maybe you experienced abuse, and the shame of that still haunts you. But when you get unprocessed trauma, nothing feels safe anymore. Home doesn't feel safe anymore. It can be, work doesn't feel safe or something like that. Always have a chip on your shoulder, always looking to see who's going to hurt you next. That's the kind of stuff that happens when we have unprocessed trauma. That could even be into a spiritual realm of asking God, why does this happen to me? Why am I all alone? And so at the bottom of 25, the quote, trauma breeds in man fear, religious cynicism, dark feelings of insecurity, mistrust, anxiety, loneliness, and more. I've seen each of these lived out in men's lives over the years, just one after the other. And that's where being in this, you'll start to see these wounds come out in your friend's life. Like, why do they make that decision over and over? They keep making the same mistake. They keep dating the same wrong girls every time. And a lot of it will come back to one of these trouble spots that's been unprocessed in their life. But especially with trauma, we tend to go back to old patterns as a result of that. And so now we get into the fourth one. This is when people get real still sometimes. But we need to address some of the trouble spots, okay? And this one may hit some of us as a result of that, but it's the addictive habits, also known as secret habits. The big three would be alcohol, drugs, and pornography. Gambling is a close fourth now. It's rising all the time because young guys have so much access to it. It's become more of an issue. But it's, when you look at these are habits, rituals that begin to go and happen in our life, and they impact the brain. That's what happens when we start talking about addictive habits. And you might have one of these trouble spots. You could say, yeah, that's me. Maybe it's, I have a drink every now and then. It becomes, I have a drink every night. I might need more than one drink every night. It begins to grow. That's what happens with addictions. They begin to grow over time, and doing it more, pushing it a little more, using drugs to self-medicate. Usually, the opioid crisis is real in our country, and it usually starts because somebody hurts their back or something like that, and they start on pain pills. I had one guy, I'm just going to tell you a little of his story. It was a man and his wife and their small daughter that we got connected to at church. And we were in small group together, and all of a sudden, one day, we're in intervention. He's a white-collar worker in the suburbs, and he was doing heroin all the time. And so we had to have an intervention. We got him to rehab, got him clean. What I didn't know is there was other addictions in his life, but just like a year and a half after that, it was his wife's birthday. And it was his job after work to go get the cake and come home for her birthday. And he didn't show up. So she tracked his phone, and she went over, and he was at his coworker's house with another woman on his wife's birthday. She caught him in the act. Now, we sat him down. It was just the three of us, and I said, look, I'm with her. Like, if she's out, I'm going to have her back on this. She has every right to walk away from you right now. We will have her back. Now, she chose to push forward with at least getting him healthy, because what I was counseling her was, look, this is your daughter's dad regardless. He needs to be as healthy as possible. She chose to press into that, and I walked alongside both of them. It got worse from there, because then he was so upset over that, he ended up getting drunk in his parking lot of his house or in his condos, and he shot himself in the leg. So I get a call, and so we show up. His wife and this guy have now hopped in the ambulance, and they're gone. His mistress is the one holding the child. So we take the child from the mistress. That's how messed up this was, okay? That's how it was not. There's no redemption in this story. That's what you think when you start talking about it. But he got help, worked the plan. I walked alongside both of them. We had men around him. We had a lot of support for her. But over time, they got to a place of healing. And this is 10 years later, and they're healthy in a marriage. And I'm still not sure every day. I check on him because I just don't know. I just saw him go down these patterns, but something clicked in his life that he wanted to be the man. He had a clear vision of the man he wanted to be for his daughter. And so those wounds started to play in together through that. But it usually starts early in life and then stays late. 90% of addictions start before the age of 18. And so when you get into the idea of what happens there, pornography and drugs have the same effect on the brain. They're talking about the first time you take that hit of a drug and there's so many endorphins that are released. The next time you take it, there's less. Maybe it's not hard drugs for you, but it's the same thing with caffeine right now. If none of us had ever had a cup of coffee and we all drank a cup of coffee, we're not sleeping tonight. That would, we would be wired out of our minds. I can drink a cup of coffee right now. I'll be asleep in 10 minutes. I am tired. My body is built up because your body begins to build more receptors for the drugs that you're using. Well, that's the same with this. So that endorphin level drops every time you take it. And that's why it leads itself to more and more. It's the same with the first time you looked at pornography. That endorphin rush was at a certain level, and it takes more and more. And so here's a statistic. Let me find out where that's at in here. There was a study that showed that 25% of the prescription of drugs like Viagra go to men under the age of 30, due in part mainly because of the heavy use of pornography. They can't I knew a guy, he couldn't physically perform with his wife anymore because he was so addicted to pornography. That's because you need more and more in order to get to the same levels. And so it's impacting our society. And here's what I want to say about that, because, when you look at addictions, we think it's not that big a deal. I can handle it. We go behind the door. We lock the door. We think it doesn't hurt anybody else. But it's like you find a baby bear cub, and it's so cute. So you decide to keep it as a pet, and you start to feed it, and it gets bigger over time. And then one day you realize it's no longer your pet. You're its pet, and it could devour you at any moment. You can't feed those things in your life because they will devour you. There was a story. This is how Eskimos kill a wolf in freezing temperatures. And the way the story goes is the Eskimo will take a bucket of blood and take a knife. And he'll dip a sharp knife in the blood and put it out in the cold, and it'll freeze. He'll dip it in again and refreeze it and do it over and over until he has this beautiful blood popsicle. And he'll stake it in the ground and then wait for the wolf to come. Wolf comes along, licks it, tastes good. It's blood, right? And so it starts to lick the blood. And over time, its mouth gets numb, and it licks away all that blood. Now it's just rubbing against that sharp blade. Now it's cutting its own mouth, but it doesn't know that because it's numb from the cold. And they will literally continue to drink that blood until they finally get dizzy, pass out, and die because they devoured themselves. When we say it's just one more time, I can give in to this, we're feeding and devouring ourselves at the same time. That's what happens. You can't keep feeding the addictions. And so that's what it says in Proverbs 25:28 here. Like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit, no self-control. It means a city without walls means there's no protection. How do you protect yourself in the midst of that? And so here's the trouble with the big lie. We say, I can handle it. I can handle it. You know, I've had that conversation with so many guys that were struggling with something. I can deal with this. How's that worked out for you in the past? I can kick that pornography habit that I started when I was 12 years old, and we're still dealing with it today. How's that working out for us when we say, I can handle it on my own? Sometimes we need to be aware that we need help in these areas. And so that's going to lead into the next part, because we're going to engage in these issues. We're going to encourage you to engage. I'm not going to be like, raise your hand if you deal with pornography, or raise your hand. I'm not doing that. I'm saying the way BetterMan is set up is they give you the facts, they give you the information. You've got to decide, am I going to step up and be a better man, or am I going to say, I'm going to believe those lies that I can do it myself. I don't need any help. I don't want anybody else in on my business. So the next wound comes into that too, and that is no close friends. Now this is a self-inflicted wound. And it says here, isolation is at best unhealthy and at worst it's deadly. We're just seeing men don't have friends anymore. Used to be a group of guys. Now we're lucky to have one close friend, maybe two, you know. And part of that goes back to some other ones. We've been hurt by others, and so we don't trust anybody because the people the closest to us are the ones that hurt us. Family members hurt us, those kind of things. And so when you start going into this, there was this interesting article. It was about a mountain climbing expert that trained others into mountain climbing. And here's what he talked about. You know, I don't want to mountain climb ever. I think it sounds cool. That's great for you. I want to go and find a piece of the woods. I don't want to go hiking. I don't want to go 5 miles. I want to go 5 feet, hang a hammock, start my fire, and cook a good steak. Like, that is a good day in the woods for me. But like, guys want to climb a mountain? Cool. Well, here's what he says about it. When you go mountain climbing, the most dangerous thing you can do is go out and climb alone, he said. He said, you're so vulnerable. If the weather changes in a moment, if you come across something you can't handle. And then he said, and here's the interesting part, you won't push yourself as hard either. You start giving into your fears quicker. I think about that when I had a workout gym at my house. Eventually, you know, every kid wanted one. We got one. It's bench press. Do you think I maxed out my bench press by myself? You know, like, no, because I knew I'd be rolling it off my chest and down. If you've ever gotten stuck, you know, with it on your hip, and you've got to swing it off. You don't want to take those risks when there's nobody there. You want a spotter to do that. It's the same with life. When you don't have those people to help push you forward, and that's what he says. You take bigger, you go on from there. When you climb with somebody else, he says, it's amazing how you can handle the adversity, you can handle the changes, and you push yourself more. And that's why you see it in your notes here. Real manhood is a team sport. And I love how it says it in Ecclesiastes, 2 are better than 1. We usually use this for weddings, but it's actually just talking about 2 people. 2 people are better for 1, for if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the man who falls when there is no one left to pick him up. Have you ever been walking around, like as a kid, maybe you left your fly open, and you're walking around and nobody tells you? You know, your friends are all laughing at you and letting you go all day long just like that. And you're like, why didn't you tell me? Like, that's not what we're talking about with friends, okay? You need people in your life to go, hey, man, your fly's undone. You know, hey, man, you're bleeding out right now. No, it's just a flesh wound. No, man, it's affecting others. You're hurting your wife. You're hurting your kids. You need people to speak truth in your life. You got to have those. And it's not just some stranger off the street that's telling you that. You need people that you trust, that you give permission to speak into your life like that. And if you don't have them, go find them. Go find at least one friend. Now, that, you know, you got people that maybe you're sharing stories with right now. and you're like, we have a lot in common. Do not call them up and say, hey, would you like to become my close friend? They're going to block your calls and walk like that. Whoa, whoa, whoa. But you might just decide to go do something together and see if you get along and go from there. Find some things in common. So here's the thing. Women like to connect face to face. So think coffee shop, little table. They're sipping their tea, looking into each other's souls, as they find out what each other is doing. Guys, we don't want that. We're shoulder to shoulder. We're not face to face. We're shoulder to shoulder. Maybe we're fishing together. We're doing something together. Hey man, can you help me with something at the house? And you go and do it together. That's how we connect. And so finding somebody, you've got to make that point to just take that next step. And that's one of those action steps that you may need in your life. So that's the trouble spot, no close friends. And then the final one is to be spiritually stuck, to get spiritually stuck. This one can be deceptive. Maybe you haven't been there, but maybe you have. You grew up years ago, but like you look at this list, and have you ever gotten to this state in your life where you say these things? Why would a loving God let this happen to me? These believers betrayed me. You got hurt by church. Or I trusted God and it didn't work. Or my parents are spiritual fakes. You saw how they acted at church and you saw how they acted at home, and it was two different things, and you walked away. I struggle with doubts about God, or my church was a terrible experience. If that's at friendship right now, tell somebody else. Don't tell me. That'll hurt my heart. No, I'm kidding. But what better do we deal with these things than in a room where, we need to be in a space where we can talk about those things. You need to feel the freedom to be able to share your doubts. There's people, we're talking about spiritually stuck. I'm talking about the sun standing still this morning, and for them, like they have real problems with Christianity and science. Do you feel the freedom to share that in your Sunday school class or with your friends to say, like, I'm struggling with that? We feel like we have to hold that in, so we just stuff it down. And we're like, I don't have doubts. I can't have doubts. Because that's not Christian. And the truth is, you can have real doubts. You can have ups and downs. That's what it means to walk alongside this together. And so sometimes we have these feelings and we've not processed them. That's what I'm getting at. And that's why we bring all these up through here. So I want to just give you a second to look back over the trouble spots. There's 6 of them now. And maybe you look at those and you find one that just really stands out, and that's the most affected you. Maybe it's the dad wound or lack of vision. Maybe it's no close friends. Maybe you've got a couple you need to just put a mark beside. But I just want to invite you to take just a minute before we move on to how to address the trouble spots, and maybe mark 1 or 2 that might have maybe you're over it now. You have victory in your life in those areas, but it's the one that's impacted you the most. Okay? That's the point of this. So just take a second. All right, so as we identify those, how do you address it? Just these last couple of minutes, we want to take some time and talk about that. The first thing we need to do as we do that is to name it. And so you name it. That's what we're doing right now. And we hate doing this as guys because the next part is to share it. Okay? We can identify, but we just want to take that and deal with it ourselves. And again, how's that working out for you? How's that worked in the past? That's what we need to understand about this when we do this, because how many times have you told yourself before, I can solve this problem on my own? There's not enough YouTube videos and Google searches that's really going to give us that. Usually it's going to take, going to need help. Some of these are going to need counselors. In fact, it says on the next page, Proverbs 14, in the abundance of counselors, there's victory. That's about people giving advice in your life, not like counselors you go to, but we think it's weakness to go to the doctor. We think it's weakness to get help. Like, we have no problem with, professionals in certain areas, but then there's other parts where we're just not sure we want to go there because it seems like weakness. I found this out in men's fraternity. I was going through this, and there was a part in the older version. I'm sure we'll get to it in a man and his wife, but there's the fears of a woman. There's certain fears that a woman has, and he touched on different areas. But for me, I realized that my wife's one of her greatest fears is that I'm going to die and leave her all alone. And so every time I was like hurting, and I was super gluing parts of my body back together way too often, for her, that instilled, like she was fearful. When I started going to the doctor, that actually gave her reassurance that I'm going to be here. I had no idea. Like I had no clue until I was going through it, and I realized there was a blind spot in my life. I needed to address that. And I have not gone to the doctor enough. And I couldn't figure out, to me, I thought I was being tough. A few years ago, I had a meeting at 6 o'clock, and I was hanging off the side of my house, and the guy called me for it. And I looked, and I hit the hammer, and the back of the claw hit me in the lip, and it went all the way through. I could whistle through the hole in my mouth. So I super glued it up, and I went to my meeting. And she was so mad at me about that I didn't go to like the emergency room. And I had a little scar there and stuff. I've got scars in places because super glue does not heal well. I have learned that over time. But I thought, I'm saving us money. That's another one of our fears all the time, it seems like, So what gives? And I just didn't have a way to win because I didn't understand what was going on. When you start talking about these things, I needed counsel around me. I needed people to give me that kind of advice to how to be understanding with my wife. Proverbs 13:20 says, to he who walks with the wise will be wise. And James 5:16, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. That he who walks with the wise will be wise. They say you're a conglomeration of your 5 best friends. I think that's hard for some of us because we don't have 5 best friends anymore. But like talking to teenagers, the 5 kids you hang out with, that's who you're going to be. Time and again, you start to see that play out. So who do you want to place yourself around? Who are the dads you want to place yourself around? Who are the men at work you want to place yourself around to become more like them? And we definitely are uncomfortable with the idea of confessing our sins to one another, but it says, and be healed. Like there's healing that comes from that. In the Baptist tradition, we don't tend to do a lot of confession to one another, and we're not about to turn to one another and confess our sins or anything like that. But there is something, some of you found it in that story, when you shared things that you never thought you'd share with another soul, and how freeing that was, even in your own life. And we weren't even doing the spiritual aspect of it, of confession. It was just sharing our stories. So if you're open and transparent with others, you have the opportunity to be the best version of yourself. So what we need to do, that final part, is to engage it. To get a plan with trusted family members and sources or friends to support you in this and take action. Maybe for you, that's a good time to say, whatever you decided was your trouble spot and you need to get help, maybe that's on your BetterMan action plan. We're not going to be looking at your action plan that I know of. That's for you. But at the end, we're going to take on the next page, when you start your BetterMan question that started in session 2, the things you write there is going to compile itself to the end to have a BetterMan plan. And we'll forget this over the next 8 weeks. And so maybe there's something that you can put down right there. God's not scared of your problems. He's not scared of your failures. Failure isn't final. He wants to redeem through us. And it is going to be hard to work through some of this, but I'm an Alabama fan, so I don't mind that there's a Nick Saban quote. Some of you are still offended by him, but he's retired, so we're past that, right? But he says, if you can't overcome hard, you're never going to have any great victories in your life. Some of this is going to be hard work, but I know every time I've had to put in hard work, it was worth it. And I saw the payoff as a result of that. So I've resolved that I'm going to be real. I want real men in my life to help me deal with this stuff, to deal with their stuff. That's the life I want. And so I don't know what you're facing, but I want to encourage you in this stuff. Maybe you're dealing with one of these trouble spots. Maybe you deal with all of these trouble spots. They don't have to define you, but we've got to take steps, name it, share it with somebody, and then engage it and start working on the problem, because we all know sitting back and hoping that it goes away never works. That's passive. And we want to be men of action and become the man we know God wants us to be. So